Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix, your host, and I'm pleased that you're with us today. Capital Insight is a program that's designed to give all of us a little more insight into what goes on in our capital city and its environs. And again, we hope that you'll enjoy the show and that you'll develop more insight into how our government works and serves our community. Our guest today is someone very special, someone who's been in the news nationally and statewide, both because of his role as president of our Senate, our state Senate, but also because of his role in being an advocate nationally and in Oregon for a health care system that works. I'm referring to John Kitzhaber, president of the Oregon Senate. Welcome to Capital Insight.
Glad to be here.
We were talking a little bit before the show that we really try to go along and just have a stream of consciousness kind of conversation. But I always like to develop a little background information about the guests on the show. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from? I know you're a Roseburg emergency room physician and the like, but where did you come from?
Well, I was born in Washington State. Have spent most of my life in Oregon. Went to South Eugene High School. Went to Dartmouth College in New Hampshire as an undergraduate, and then came back and went to medical school up in Portland. Then did an internship in Denver, Colorado, and then back to Roseburg, where I started my practice in emergency medicine in '74.
What compelled you to enter the world of medicine?
Well, actually, it's kind of ironic given what's happened with this healthcare adventure I've been on. I was interested in doing research and designing and building artificial organs. And I went into med school to learn more about human anatomy and physiology to pursue my sort of research interest, but not to practice. And when I was in med school, most of the pure research money that was available under the Johnson administration dried up, and there was not that many opportunities for research. And I discovered emergency medicine senior year in med school and became quite enamored with the specialty.
Well, did you spend several years in that before you headed into politics, or did you pick up on politics pretty quick?
Well, actually, my interest in politics preceded my interest in medicine. I was a junior at Dartmouth in 1968, and all of that entails. I was involved in the civil rights movement and a lot of the student activism that went on in the late 60s. And there were two events in '68 that sort of drove me into an active interest in politics. One was the assassination of Martin Luther King, and the other of Robert Kennedy. I don't think that's unique. I think there are a lot of people my age that went into politics for those same traumatic events. And so I went to Roseburg and started practicing in '74 with the intention of running for office. I did 4 years of ER medicine and then ran in 1978. And really until recently I've been able to maintain both, but it's become increasingly difficult.
Was your choice of emergency room medicine in part based on the idea that, at least as I understand it, that's a job where in effect you work for certain hours, you know you've got defined duties, but you don't have to carry a patient load away from the emergency room?
Yeah, you don't have an outside call. Your commitment is when you're on duty, and it gives you a lot of schedule flexibility. Actually, it wasn't a consideration when I went into it. I enjoyed it. It was fast-paced. You had to make quick decisions, and you could see the consequences of your decisions very, very rapidly. But as it turned out, it gave me the kind of schedule flexibility that allowed me to participate in the legislature as well as maintain a practice.
I'm curious, did that help you develop your triage skills, that is the medical concept of prioritizing who needs medical services and making determinations, well, this patient, although they came in 10 seconds ago, needs attention ahead of this patient who's been here 10 minutes because here we have a gunshot wound and someone's bleeding profusely as opposed to someone who's come in with strep throat or whatever. Has that affected your attitude about having to prioritize health care?
Oh, I think definitely. You know, we do that in the emergency room as a matter of course, and if you look at the priority list that our own Health Services Commission produced, it's fairly similar to the kind of triage system that you would establish in an emergency department. Beyond that, I think that you know, one of the reasons I got into this healthcare issue, I came to the legislature with an interest in the environment and public education. Healthcare wasn't even on the screen until the late '80s. When I became president of the Senate, I became co-chair of the Emergency Board, which I'm sure your viewers know is the sort of the mini fiscal committee that takes care of state fiscal affairs between the legislative sessions. And we began to do things to balance the budget that involved changing eligibility or reducing coverage and essentially dropping people from coverage in order to balance the budget. It was a sterile budgetary exercise. But then 6 months later, I'd go back to my emergency room and I'd begin to see people coming in who were the direct victims, if you will, of this silent social rationing. And in each case, they delayed seeking treatment for minor problems until they became very, very serious because they'd lost their insurance coverage. It was a real aha experience that we were, in fact, rationing health care, but assuming no accountability for the very human consequences of it.
It was sort of an invisible rationing in the sense that you weren't calling it rationing, you were talking about eligibility, but in effect, instead of saying, well, we've got 100 people and we're going to give them X level of care, say, I'll make it up, a 0.5 level of care, we're going to give 100% care to 50 people. And you were rationing care in terms of who got through the front door.
We basically didn't want to deal with the question of what's covered. And we didn't want to look at whether everything we were providing in the name of health care actually was beneficial in terms of improving health. We just didn't want to deal with benefits. So what we do is we redefine the poor for accounting purposes. You're poor on Monday because of your income level. Tuesday, we've just changed the rules of the game, and you're out of the program. And it's analogous to high-level bombing, where you don't see the faces of the people that you're impacting by your decisions. But there are very serious, real human consequences of those kinds of budgetary decisions, which is how we ration health care in America in 1992.
Well, let me take you back for a moment then. And you were talking about the beginning of your political career in Roseburg in '74.
Yes.
You started out in the emergency room. Was it 4 years later that you were first elected?
I ran in '78 for the House, right.
And how long did you serve in the House?
One term in the House, and then I ran for the Senate in '80. And was elected president after the '84 election.
Now, you've often been seen as what I'll call a moderate Democrat. Now, whatever that means, I think it means a Democrat who moves around on the issues and focuses on each issue without necessarily having a knee-jerk reaction. I mean that as a compliment. But in that role, and as president of the Senate, have you had to deal with pretty diverse constituencies among the senators?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's no question that there's a real diversity. I mean, it's just like the society in general. But I think the major issues that confront Oregon really aren't Republican or Democratic issues. How we fund our schools, how we pay for health care, how we provide adequate housing, the safety of our communities. All of these issues are people issues. And if you can get past the ideology, and there are ideologues in both parties, and they're out on the fringes, and I think there's a big group of us in the middle that actually make policy and get things done. And it's been a very interesting experience. My district is heavily timber dependent, and I've received most of the statewide environmental awards over the last 10 years. And what I've discovered is that that a healthy timber economy is not inconsistent with a sound environment. But that issue too has been polarized by the extremes on both sides. And what I've been able to do in Roseburg is bring the players together and find the common ground and start from there as a premise, and it's worked very effectively, and I think you can approach most problems like that.
Now, other than the health care issue, which I want to talk about again for a moment, and then budgets and taxes and the like, is there some issue area that you think that when you first came into the legislature, you were in the House and then first in the Senate, before you became Senate President, that you were most focused on, that you felt the most involved in?
Well, probably the environment and public education. I mean, I think those are probably the two most significant issues that we have to confront as a nation and as a state in the years to come. How do you balance economic growth and environmental protection? And how do you educate children? Because as you well know, the workforce of the 21st century is going to be sort of information driven. And I fear that our kids getting out of high school don't have the tools necessary to compete in that kind of market.
Let me switch you to something of a technical subject, but one that had a lot of social consequences, and that's the workers' compensation reforms of 1990 and Governor Goldschmidt's push for that and your involvement in that process. At the time, there was a lot of infighting going on. I'll call them among special interest groups. Some of them were pretty broad, some of them were pretty narrow. Yeah. And yet you played what I'll call a healing role in trying to bring in very many Democrats who didn't want to go along at first with the reforms, and a moderating role in terms of what reforms were developed. How do you feel now, looking back 2 years, about that process? Were there things that you would have done differently, or are you pretty satisfied with where we've gone with that?
I basically am satisfied with where we've gone. It's not to say that there aren't problems that have developed in the legislation, as they always do, particularly when you do it in a special session like that. But I think it's had I think it's been essentially a beneficial a step in the right direction. The difficulty we face with workers' comp, and you know a lot more about this subject than I do, is that it's enormously complicated, and so people approach it without, legislators approach it without having, the kind of detailed understanding to really get at the core issues, and that's the same with health care. And one of the things I think we were able to do in that session is take a step towards sort of demystifying workers' comp. It's not, the objectives of the system, as you know, aren't very complicated. but it's gotten overridden by various groups that some of them are making significant bucks off the system, including my profession, elements of the legal profession, insurance industries. And you got to cut through that and find out really what's at stake. And that's one of those issues where there is a lot of sort of ideologic knee-jerking on both sides of the spectrum. But I think we got a product together. It's not perfect, but it moves us in the right direction, I think.
I'm going to pause for a moment and mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, your host. If you ever have any questions or concerns or comments, please feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. Our guest today is the President of the Oregon Senate, John Kitzhaber, and we've been talking about a variety of things already in the first third or so of this show. We were just talking about the workers' comp reforms and that process, and I'd like to ask you a question, because I wonder, wasn't there something in that process that gave us an example of how we might have dealt with special session this past July when we were dealing with tax issues? Were there some things that happened in that workers' comp special session that we ought to look to as a model for activity?
I suppose you know, if you set the product aside, that was a process where the governor had brought the special interests, I mean the players that do represent those interests that are affected by workers' comp, which is namely labor, business, the medical community, insurance community, together for, I don't know, 6 or 7 months beforehand, and they developed a consensus product sort of outside the confines of the legislature, and then legislators were brought into that process. So we knew what was coming. Not everybody liked what was coming, but we knew what was coming. And that package was given to a special legislative committee, and then we were given the opportunity to fine-tune it and to make whatever changes were necessary to get the necessary votes to adopt the thing. So we were not asked to come in and just pass something. And I remember those hearings very, very well. And I think we had some preliminary hearings and then some right during the session. But it was a matter of give and take, and we got the areas we agreed with off the table and focused specifically on those we disagreed on, and were able to make some responsible compromises and get the package out.
Do you think we'll be able to do something along those lines with the general issues of tax reform and budgets for Oregon in 1992 and 93?
Yeah, I do. I of course believe there's no survival value in pessimism, but I do believe that we can. And I think everybody in the state recognizes that we have a problem. I think there's a legitimate disagreement about the magnitude of the problem. There's a disagreement about exactly how it should be solved. But admitting that we do have a problem, I think, is an essential first step. And it's, consensus is a process. Consensus building is a process of inclusion. It's a process of determining the areas where you agree, and then looking at a range of options on those areas where you disagree that still drive you towards some common policy objective. And I think that the work that we're attempting to do with the Joint Committee on Oregon's Future that's been meeting since June is going to be a constructive, is in fact already playing a constructive role in bringing the different diverse groups back together in terms of finding an ultimate solution.
Do you think, and I know it's speculation at this point, but do you think that there's the prospects for a special session, say in December, before the new legislature comes in January?
I think that, yes, I think there is a possibility of that. It's certainly too early to make a call on it, because the first step is to get a bipartisan, bicameral consensus on the magnitude of the revenue issue. And we're attempting to do that by linking dollars to services. So instead of just more money to fill a gap created by Measure 5, we're talking about dollars to fund specific services that Oregonians understand and can appreciate the relevance to their own lives and their own communities. If we're successful in that process, then it's time to talk about what we do and when we do it. And certainly we have discussed the possibility of a session prior to the regular session in January.
As you've gotten more involved in this, before the show you mentioned it, or early on in this show you've mentioned that it's required that you kind of pull yourself away from your practice and focus on the politics side. Do you have any opportunity now to carry on any practice at all?
I haven't been in the ER, in the emergency room, probably for about 3 years. That's primarily because you have to put in a certain number of hours just to be competent with your technical skills. I've kept up my continuing education skills, but you can't put in a chest tube once every 2 months and feel competent with that. So I have been working in our urgent care clinic down in Roseburg, which is a sort of a like an adult and pediatric walk-in clinic, less serious problems, until about a year and a half ago. And at that point, really, the responsibilities of trying to get the waiver out of Washington, D.C. and the revenue picture that we're facing in the state has just kept me so busy that I haven't really been able to practice at all the last 18 months.
Does that raise questions about our citizen legislature and efforts to maintain that, or would you consider this a special circumstance? Because there's always this debate going on about, well, we ought to have full-time legislators, or when I say a citizen legislature, we're all citizens, of course, but the idea is I guess we almost ought to call it a civilian legislature, those of us who put the uniform on 6 months every 2 years, and then otherwise during the interim we're doing weekend warrior kind of duty like the reservists, we're maybe a day or two a week of politics.
I think there's a real value to having legislators go back and work and live in their communities part of the year. I mean, I really do think there's a value to that. It's becoming increasingly difficult, however, particularly in a leadership position, to do a competent job with a state of almost 3 million people and maintain a profession. One way to, I think, address that would be to reorganize the way we do the legislature. You know, right now we have the session, then we have an interim where we sort of study problems, and then we have an election. And a lot of the people that studied those problems don't come back, and there's no continuity. And to me, it might make more sense for us to come in and organize and then have the interim. That is, have the various committees work to resolve the major issues that are confronting us, get them all worked out, and come in for a very short session to actually accomplish that legislatively. Not unlike a special session. You do the hard work in public through the regular committee meeting process first, and then have the session. And that might, I think, certainly make the interim more productive. But I like the idea of a hiatus where people go back to their communities. But it is getting difficult, no question about it.
Do you think that it sounds like there's some middle ground here where, for instance, if we do make some changes in how we schedule things, we can do that in terms of the individual legislators, but then for the leadership we might talk about a shift where the Senate President and the Speaker of the House maybe ought to be considered a full-time job and paid as such?
I think that, I guess maybe it depends on where you live. I live 2.5 hours away, and Speaker Campbell lives an hour away, and I'm in the office 3 times a week probably. And basically I've never let go of my apartment in Salem after the last legislature, which I generally do. So there is some argument, and I guess it depends what you want the leadership to do. But it is very difficult to maintain, at least a medical practice, and I would suspect many other vocations as well in a leadership position.
Speaking from the lawyer's perspective with a law practice, I could not imagine being able to put the amount of time in that you're doing and maintaining a private practice.
Difficult. It'd be very difficult.
Well, let's shift again a little more here and talk some more about the taxes and spending situation. If we go into a session in January without a solution, what would you predict in terms of what would happen with the regular session?
Well, you'd have a whole lot of presumably you'll have a lot of new members who don't have the history of what's been going on with Measure 5 and the long-term efforts to stabilize school financing. And you have one of those circumstances where you're trying to raise revenue on the one hand and balance a budget on the other hand. And that creates a very unhealthy dynamic where you just don't know exactly how to build the budget. And if you recall, back in '83, we had a session that went to August, and that was the dynamic that was going on there. There was a 3-month special session in 1982, same thing. And I really think that it's the responsibility of this legislature to address Measure 5 in whatever way we're going to address it this calendar year. It happened on our shift. It happened on our watch. We have a responsibility to deal with it. Unless we're willing to say there's not a problem, we don't really need to deal with it. That's okay if people want to say that. I don't happen to agree with that position.
I'll pause again for a moment and mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, your host. Capital Insight is available to our audience every month as a public service feature, and I hope it helps folks develop some better insight into what goes on in government and politics in our state capital. If you ever have any questions or concerns, feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H 395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon 97310. Our guest today is the President of the Oregon Senate, John Kitzhaber, and we've been talking about a multitude of things, which is the way I like to do it anyway. And I wanted to shift again. We were just talking about the dynamics of the next session and all of that. Turning to politics and those dynamics, we're probably talking about at least a third of the House members being new people. What kind of impact does this have politically? You talked about the freshman legislator having to get up to speed. Are you also looking at the possible impact of whether it's Democrats or Republicans, or do you see this as something we're going to have to approach on a bipartisan basis?
Well, that's a good question. I believe that the issue of a responsible budget to take care of those programs and services that are essential to maintain the social and economic integrity of this state is not a partisan issue. I don't think it matters whether the Democrats or the Republicans control the House. We've still got it to do. And I don't think we'll do it substantially differently, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans that control the House. Now, that's not to say that control of the House doesn't matter, because there's a whole host of other issues, natural resource issues, land use issues, taxation policy, that are very, very critical. But this issue is of such overriding importance and has such a significant potential for what happens to the state in the future that I would hope that we recognize that the sooner we resolve it, the better, and that it's not going to be easier, or that the solution is going to be substantially different because we delay and wait until January.
Now let me shift again and ask about the Oregon Health Plan, which you've been very much associated with because of your leadership in developing it and proselytizing in favor of it. Do you have any projections as to where we're going to go the next 3 months or next 4 or 5 months following the administration's refusal of approval?
The administration's refusal was a tissue-thin excuse for denying the waiver. The plan clearly does not violate the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is which is the premise. The D.C. lawyers came out, and their case went something like this. The benefit package is great. It doesn't in any way discriminate against the disabled. But we believe the process by which you arrived at that benefit package might discriminate against the disabled, although we have no legal analysis or any other way to substantiate our suggestions. Now fix it. And my read of that is they want to delay making a decision until after the November election.
There's no way to fix a process that has already occurred unless the product is defective.
Well, that's my view, but they didn't want to talk about the product. They wanted to talk about the process. And I think that we'll certainly reapply, at least both the governor and Speaker Campbell are very committed to this. The alternative is the existing program, which is really in failure. I suspect we'll reapply. We're taking them in good faith. We're trying to make the corrections they've suggested, most of which we've already made. We're sending a letter back this week to see if that's sufficient. So we haven't given up on it yet, and of course if there's a change in administration, we have a commitment out of Governor Clinton that he would facilitate the waiver. So it's not over till it's over.
That's right. Well, let's talk about you personally and your own political career, because you're finishing up your term and you've chosen not to run for re-election in the Senate, which means you also won't be president of the Senate after, well, come early January when the new legislature is sworn in. Well, I'm sure you've thought about what you're going to do. Maybe you could share some of those thoughts with us.
Well, first of all, it's better to dismount gracefully than get shot out of the saddle, I suppose, right? I've been president for 4 consecutive terms, and you know, what happens after a while is you begin to lose some of your natural philosophic allies for the wrong reasons. There's other very gifted people in the Senate who want to move up into leadership positions, and there's just a little more tension every time you don't keep a hold of the reins. And I think it is time to kind of get out. Not that I don't enjoy the process, mind you. I think I'm not being coy at all when I tell you I'm not sure what I'm going to do. I want to practice a bit more. I want to keep my hand in primary care medicine, and I'd like to stay actively involved in public policy issues as they relate to healthcare, education, and the environment, but I haven't really thought out what venue I'll play that out in.
Well, I mean, I need to be blunt here. It seems to me that you've got all the characteristics of someone who ought to be running for statewide office. Intelligence, charisma, a well-known, balanced philosophy. I'm giving you a speech here, you see. This is a nominating speech.
I see.
And many people have talked about you in that context. What about John Kitzhaber for statewide office? There's a variety of offices out there. I mean, would you like to share whether or not that thought has ever crossed your mind?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'd be very candid with you. I have no interest in going to Washington, D.C. I can't imagine leaving Oregon, and something happens to you back there. I mean, maybe it's the water or the air. I'm just not sure that I'd be interested in doing that. Being governor is something that I have thought about, but I want to make it very clear that I supported Governor Roberts in her last election, and if she chooses to run again, I will also support her for a second term. It's just not my style to run against a member of my own party who I substantially agree with philosophically. So that moves the whole agenda down the road quite a ways, and I don't plan to spend the next 6 years of my life hoping for a chance to run for governor. You know, I mean, politics is timing, and I would hope I can find a role to make a contributions to the state and its future as a private citizen.
Flexibility is the watchword here, isn't it? That is, you're flexible, you'll be around and you'll be doing things, and I'm just making things up here, but...
Well, I'm not leaving Oregon. There was an amusing thing happened when Jim Weaver dropped out of the U.S. Senate race back in the 80s. I was on a raft going down the Rogue River, and Jeff Mapes of the Oregonian said, well, I wrote a story saying I wasn't really interested in this because I didn't respond immediately. And the only way you can do that is, of course, have a cellular phone in your raft. I don't plan to be that flexible.
Well, that's reasonable enough. Have you thought about, when you mentioned Washington, D.C., a lot of our politicians do focus on that as an ultimate goal. I've always wondered why. I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and there's no aura to it as far as I'm concerned. You're right, you lose touch with a lot of other realities. And it might be something you do as a matter of need or public service at some point, but I can't see it as being something that should draw you away, particularly if politicians who've got roots here and feel comfortable with the environment we have in Oregon. Well, in this interim, besides practicing, do you think you'll be involved, practicing medicine, do you think that you'll be involved in community affairs or organizations that deal with the legislature? Could John Kitzhaber come back as a lobbyist?
Not in this life. I have no desire to do that. I think when you leave, you leave. But I love this state, and there are just a lot of things that you can do. One of the great things about Oregon is that there are so many opportunities for private citizens to have a significant impact in policy issues. And I plan to, the state's given me a lot, and I plan to continue to try to repay that by being involved in some other venue as a private citizen.
Do you think that you'll maintain your residence in Roseburg, or is it too early to tell?
Well, actually, I bought 10 acres of land up the North Umpqua River, where I hope to build a cabin. It's beautiful, overlooking the falls down there. And I'll probably be spending some time down there. Again, depending on what I do, I may have to spend a bit of time up in the valley or up in Portland, depending on how I decide to play out my involvement in policy issues. But I don't plan to leave Douglas County.
Has anybody given you a hard time for what I perceive to be a balanced view towards life, that there are other things besides politics? Has anyone said, you should always be on the job, always pushing, instead of taking off and relaxing?
Well, some people have said, it's just not responsible for you to leave, right now with this fiscal crisis facing it, and yeah, I guess I would have two answers to that. It's the height of arrogance to believe that the only person that can solve the fiscal crisis in Oregon is John Kitzhaber, and I don't believe that that's the case. We've got a lot of good people in the legislature, and the job will get done. Secondly, I've given it the office. I have no qualms about it. I've done this for 14 years, and haven't practiced full-time medicine for over a decade, and I don't feel any burden of guilt in taking a bit of time for other things in life, of which there are many.
Oh, good for you. On that note, since we've given of our time on the show today, I'll say that we're now wrapping up our Capital Insight show. Our guest has been Senate President John Kitzhaber. Excuse me. And I'm your host, Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem. We appreciate your joining us. Thank you very much. Paid for and authorized by Citizens for Mannix, 2003 State Street, Salem, Oregon, 97301.